If you think your Monday was bad, imagine waking up in the year 536 AD. You open your eyes, expecting the morning sun to hit your face, but it doesn't. You step outside, and the sky is a sickly, bruised purple-gray. The sun is there, but it looks like a ghost, a faint, dim disk that provides no warmth and barely enough light to see your own hands. This isn't just a cloudy day. This is the beginning of a night that will last 18 months. This was the start of what many historians consider the single darkest period to ever strike our species. Today, we are stepping back into the shadows to uncover the times when the world didn't just change, but almost broke entirely. We are looking at the eras of struggle that redefined the resilience of humanity. Around 1,500 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, spewed a colossal veil of ash into the atmosphere. It blanketed the northern hemisphere, reaching all the way to China and the Mediterranean. Imagine the confusion and the pure, unadulterated terror. People didn't have weather apps or geological sensors. They thought the divine had turned its back on them. For nearly 2 years, the sun provided no more light than the moon. Temperatures plummeted. Summer simply vanished. In the middle of July, snow fell in China. Crops withered in the fields before they could even sprout. Famine didn't just knock on the door. It took up permanent residence. But the darkness was just the opening act. When the world is cold and hungry, the body's defenses crumble. Just as the remnants of the Roman Empire were trying to stabilize, a microscopic predator arrived. The Byzantine Empire was hit by a plague so devastating that at its peak, it claims thousands of lives every single day in Constantinople alone. It changed the course of history, halting the expansion of empires and leaving entire cities as silent monuments to what once was. This wasn't just a bad year. It was a century of cascading disasters. Now let's move forward to a time that feels like a fever dream of chaos. The mid-14th century. If 536 was the year of darkness, the 1340s were the years of the Great Silence. We've all heard of the massive pandemic that swept through Eurasia, but to truly understand it, you have to look at the speed. This wasn't a slow burn. It traveled along trade routes, hitching a ride on the very veins of global commerce. One day, a ship would pull into a harbor in Sicily or Messina, and within weeks, the entire region would be transformed into a landscape of mourning. The psychological toll was perhaps even heavier than the physical one. People at the time truly believed they were witnessing the end of days. When you see half of everyone you know disappear in the span of a season, how do you keep going? The social fabric didn't just tear, it dissolved. Laborers disappeared, meaning those who remained suddenly had a power they never dreamed of. This era, as grim as it was, accidentally gave birth to the end of feudalism and the rise of the modern world. It's a recurring theme in our history. Out of the absolute worst conditions, the seeds of a new world are often planted, though the cost is higher than we can ever truly calculate. As we move through these eras, we have to talk about the 17th century. This is a period many people overlook, but it was a time of near-constant global struggle. Historians often call it the general crisis. From the 1610s through the 1680s, the world experienced a significant drop in temperature known as the Little Ice Age. Just like in 536, the climate was the primary antagonist. When the harvests fail year after year, the structures of society begin to grind against one another. In Europe, this manifested as a conflict that lasted 30 years, turning the heart of the continent into a wasteland. Entire regions lost more than half of their population. It wasn't just the combat, it was the secondary effects, the lack of food, the displacement of families, and the breakdown of basic order. Meanwhile, across the globe in China, the Ming dynasty, which had stood for centuries, collapsed under the weight of famine and internal strife. It's a chilling reminder that no matter how powerful a civilization seems, it is always only a few missed harvests away from total instability. Let's talk about a different kind of darkness, the early 20th century. We often think of progress as a straight line moving upward, but the years between 1914 and 1945 were a violent correction to that idea. The first great global conflict introduced a level of industrial destruction that humanity had never seen. It wasn't just the scale, it was the method. For the first time, the entire resources of nations were channeled into a singular focus of rivalry. Then, just as the world tried to catch its breath in 1918, a global respiratory illness emerged. It didn't care about borders or who had won the war. It was a silent, invisible force that took more lives in a single year than the entire 4 years of the war preceding it. Imagine coming home from the front lines, thinking the danger was over, only to find that the very air in your hometown was now the enemy. It was a period of profound disillusionment. The old world was gone, and the new one was being forged in a crucible of immense pain. As we look at these periods, you might wonder why we study them. Is it just to feel a sense of morbid fascination? No, it's because these years reveal the absolute limits of human endurance. They show us what happens when our systems fail, when nature turns against us, and when we turn against each other. Take the year 1816, often called the year without a summer. Again, we see the power of the earth beneath our feet. Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded with such force that it altered the global climate. In New England, frosts were recorded in every month of the year. In Europe, the gloom was so pervasive that it inspired the creation of some of our most famous literature. Lord Byron and Mary Shelley were stuck indoors in Switzerland because the weather was so foul, leading Shelley to write the story of Frankenstein. It is fascinating how the most difficult years in history often produce the most enduring pieces of culture. When the world outside is terrifying, we turn inward to create. However, the sheer weight of these years can be hard to process. In the mid-17th century, the British Isles were torn apart by internal conflicts that saw a king lose his head, and a whole new way of governing emerged from the rubble. The intensity of these years was so high that people truly felt they were living in a temporary world. Why build for tomorrow when tomorrow isn't guaranteed? This mindset changed how people approached art, religion, and philosophy. If we look at the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, we see perhaps the most dramatic population shift in the history of our species. The arrival of outsiders brought with it a biological exchange that the local populations were entirely unprepared for. Within a few generations, civilizations that had flourished for millennia were reduced to fragments. It is estimated that upwards of 90% of the population vanished. This wasn't a conflict of blades and shields as much as it was a conflict of biology. The very landscape changed. Forests grew back over abandoned cities, and the climate of the entire planet may have even cooled slightly because of the massive reduction in human activity and the regrowth of vegetation. Every time we look at these worst years, a pattern emerges. It's rarely one thing that brings a society to its knees. It's usually a combination. It's a volcano erupting during a time of political instability. It's a drought hitting right as a trade route opens up a path for a new ailment. It's the perfect storm of disaster. The mid-3rd century was another such time. The Roman Empire, once thought to be eternal, nearly blinked out of existence. This period, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, saw dozens of individuals claiming the throne, hyperinflation that made currency worthless, and constant pressure from every border. The empire actually split into 3 separate pieces. For 50 years, it looked like the grand experiment of Rome was over, and yet somehow it pulled back from the brink. This tells us something vital. Even when the situation looks statistically impossible, there is a capacity for recovery that is built into our collective DNA. Let's lean into the human experience of these times. We often talk about statistics. Millions of this, thousands of that. But history is made of individuals. Imagine being a farmer in the year 1348. You don't understand germs. You don't understand how the world works outside your village. You just see your neighbors getting sick and you see the local authorities fleeing. The sheer isolation and fear must have been suffocating. And yet, people still planted seeds. They still cared for their children. They still looked toward a future, even if that future looked like a void. That is the real story of the deadliest years. It's not about how many fell. It's about the fact that anyone stood back up. The 1930s provide another layer to this. It wasn't a sudden disaster like a volcano or a plague, but a slow-motion collapse of the global economy. The Great Depression showed that the systems we build to sustain ourselves can be just as fragile as our physical bodies. When the banks failed and the dust storms rolled across the plains, people were stripped of their dignity. This era proved that psychological and economic trauma can be just as impactful as physical threats. It reshaped the role of government in our lives and set the stage for the massive global shifts of the 1940s. Why does it feel like these events happen in clusters? Historians often talk about the concept of social resilience. When a society is healthy, it can handle a blow. A bad harvest is just a bad year. But when a society is already stretched thin, by overpopulation, by inequality, or by internal strife, A single spark can set the whole thing on fire. The 530s were a classic example. The Roman world was already struggling to find its new identity. The weather was the spark, and the plague was the fuel. But let's look at the resilience side again. After the 14th century, Europe saw a massive increase in the standard of living for the survivors. Because there were fewer people, wages went up. The surplus of land meant that people could afford better food. This led to a healthier population that was better equipped to resist future challenges. It is a strange, uncomfortable paradox. The times that are the hardest for the collective often lead to the greatest advancements for those who remain. If we fast forward to the 19th century, we see the rise of the industrial age, which brought its own set of worst years. The 1840s in Ireland, known as the Great Hunger, was a localized but absolute disaster. A failure of a single crop, the potato, combined with a rigid and uncaring political system, led to the loss of a massive percentage of the population through both loss of life and forced emigration. This wasn't a global event in terms of climate, but it was a global event in terms of its impact on the world's population distribution. It changed the face of North America forever. The story of humanity is one of constant movement and adaptation. When one area becomes unlivable, we move. When one way of life fails, we invent a new one. In the year 1200, the Mongol expansions began. For the next century, the world was reshaped by a force that was unprecedented in its speed and its scale. While this brought immense suffering to many cities and regions, it also created the first real global exchange of ideas, technology, and, unintentionally, biology. It linked the East and the West in a way that had never happened before, paving the way for the modern interconnected world. We have to ask ourselves, are we currently living in one of those years? To people in 536, it felt like the end. To people in 1918, it felt like the end. We have the advantage of hindsight. We know that the sun came back out in 538. We know that the pandemic of 1918 eventually receded. But when you are in the middle of the storm, you don't know if it will ever stop. The year 1945 is often seen as a turning point. It was the end of the most destructive conflict in history, but it also saw the introduction of a new kind of power, one that could potentially end the human story altogether. The years following were a period of intense anxiety, but they also saw the greatest period of technological and medical advancement we have ever known. We learned to fight back against the microscopic predators that had haunted us since the dawn of time. We learned how to produce food at a scale that would have seemed like magic to a farmer in the 17th century. But nature has a way of reminding us of our place. The 1970s saw a series of droughts and food shortages across Africa and Asia that claimed millions of lives, largely ignored by the wider world concentrated on the Cold War. It's a reminder that deadly years are often a matter of perspective. While one part of the world is flourishing, another may be experiencing its own private apocalypse. Historians use the term secular cycles to describe the rise and fall of populations and the periods of instability that come in between. It suggests that these horrific years aren't just bad luck. They are almost built into the rhythm of human expansion. We grow until we hit a ceiling, be it environmental, biological, or social, and then we experience a painful correction. The 1315 to 1317 Great Famine in Europe was exactly this. The population had grown too large for the agricultural technology of the time. When the rains didn't stop for years, the system collapsed. It was a precursor to the 1340s, a warning sign that the world was out of balance. Looking back at the year 536, it truly stands alone because of its sheer global reach and the fact that it was caused by something entirely out of human control. There was no one to blame, no policy to change, no war to stop. It was simply the earth asserting itself. And yet, even in that total darkness, people kept records. They wrote down their observations. They tried to make sense of the void. In China, chroniclers wrote about the stars being hidden for years. In the Mediterranean, historians wrote about the sun of the mind being extinguished. Their commitment to documenting their own struggle is why we know about it today. History is a cycle of breaking and rebuilding. We are currently the beneficiaries of every person who decided to plant a seed in the mud of 537, or who decided to rebuild a city in 1350. These deadliest years are not just points of tragedy on a timeline. They are the moments where the human spirit was tested most severely. Consider the 16th century again, specifically the 1520s. This was a decade of monumental change. In Europe, the old religious order was being torn apart by new ideas, leading to decades of internal struggle. In the Americas, The collision of worlds was at its most violent. The world was becoming smaller, more connected, and as a result, more dangerous. The introduction of new ways of thinking and new people to interact with often leads to a period of intense friction before a new stability is found. What can we learn from all this? First, that we are incredibly lucky to live in an era where we understand the why behind most disasters. We know why volcanoes erupt. We know how to track weather patterns. We know how to isolate and study a new illness. In the past, the lack of knowledge was almost as deadly as the event itself because it led to panic, scapegoating, and the breakdown of community. Second, we learned that the worst years often lead to the most profound shifts in human rights and social structures. The aftermath of the 1340s saw the rise of the middle class. The aftermath of the 1940s saw the creation of international bodies meant to prevent the same thing from happening again. We seem to only make the biggest leaps when we are pushed to the absolute edge. But let's talk about the psychological resilience required to survive these times. Imagine being someone in the mid-17th century, living through the Little Ice Age. You see the Thames River in London freeze over so solid that they held frost fairs on it. While that sounds charming to us, to them, it meant the shipping lanes were closed. The food wasn't moving, and people were freezing in their homes. And yet, they made a festival of it. They found a way to reclaim a bit of joy from a situation that was meant to destroy them. That is the essence of our story. We find a way to hold a fair on the ice. As we look across the centuries, from the ash-choked skies of the 6th century to the industrial battles of the 20th, we see a species that refuses to stay down. We see a world that has been ending for thousands of years. Yet here we are. Every time the darkness came, someone kept a fire burning. Every time a city went silent, someone eventually started a new conversation. The year 536 was a year of literal darkness, but it wasn't the end of the light. The 1340s were years of silence, but the song eventually returned. The deadliest years serve as a grim reminder of our fragility, but they also serve as a testament to our incredible, almost defiant durability. We are the descendants of the ones who didn't give up. We are the survivors of the worst years in history. When you look at the challenges of our own time, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But then you remember the people of the year 536, stepping out into a purple fog with no sun and no hope of a harvest. And you realize that humanity has walked through the valley of the shadow before. We have seen the sun go out, and we have lived to see it rise again. The story of the deadliest years isn't a story of loss. It's a story of what happens next. It's a story of the morning after the 18 months of darkness. It's a story of the first crop that grows after the famine. It's a story of the world that we built from the pieces of the one that broke. So next time you feel like the world is in a bad place, remember the long view. Remember that our history is defined not by our collapses, but by our recoveries. The deadliest years were just the chapters where the protagonist, humanity, had to find out what it was truly made of. And every single time, we found out that we were made of something stronger than the darkness, stronger than the cold, and more persistent than any challenge the world could throw at us. Looking at the era of the 12th century, often forgotten, we see the rise and fall of great empires in the Americas and Southeast Asia. The Maya civilization had already faced its great collapse, likely due to a combination of environmental degradation and prolonged periods of drought. Their cities, once the height of human achievement, were reclaimed by the jungle. This wasn't a sudden disaster like a volcano, but a slow, agonizing decline. It serves as a warning that we must remain in balance with our environment. The deadly years for the Maya weren't a single point on a map, but a series of decades where the system simply couldn't sustain itself anymore. And yet, the people didn't disappear. They moved. They changed their way of life. They adapted. The culture evolved into new forms that survived until the 16th century. This is another vital lesson. A change in civilization isn't the same as the end of a people. We are more than our structures. We are more than our cities. If we move to the 1880s, we see the eruption of Krakatoa. It was one of the loudest sounds ever heard in modern history, echoing for thousands of miles. It caused dramatic sunsets around the world for years, but it also caused global temperatures to drop. While not as devastating as 536, it was a reminder to a Victorian world that felt it had finally conquered nature with steam and iron, that the planet still had the final say. The 17th century's general crisis also saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire's period of expansion, the near-total decentralization of the Holy Roman Empire, and the rise of new powers in the East. This was a time when the world was literally reshaped. If you had fallen asleep in 1600 and woken up in 1700, the political, social, and physical map of the world would have been unrecognizable. These periods of high mortality and high stress are the engines of change. They are the moments when the old ways of doing things are burned away, making room for the new. Wait until you consider the sheer randomness of it all. In the 14th century, the plague didn't strike everyone equally. Some villages were completely skipped, while others were wiped out to the last person. This randomness creates a specific kind of trauma, the why me of history. It led to a surge in religious fervor, but also a surge in skepticism. It was the beginning of a move toward a more secular, evidence-based world. We started trying to find real answers because the old ones weren't working anymore. In the mid-20th century, the years 1941 to 1945 stand out as a time of unprecedented global mobilization. It was a time when almost every person on the planet was affected by a single, sprawling conflict. The deadly nature of these years was entirely human-made. It wasn't a volcano or a virus. It was choices. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of all. While we have learned to survive the Earth's tantrums, we are still learning how to survive ourselves. The 20th century proved that our capacity for creation is matched only by our capacity for friction. But even then, look at the years immediately following. The late 40s and 50s saw the fastest expansion of child survival rates, the discovery of new life-saving treatments, and a global effort to rebuild. The Marshall Plan and the redevelopment of Japan and Europe are some of the most impressive feats of collective human will in history. We took a world that had been shattered and decided to put it back together, but better. When we talk about the year 536, we have to mention the scientist Michael McCormick, who famously called it the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. When a Harvard historian makes a claim like that, you listen. The sheer amount of evidence, from tree rings to ice cores, confirms that the planet went into a shock. The darkness of 536 led to the late antique Little Ice Age. This wasn't a brief event. It was a cold snap that lasted for over a century. Imagine the generational impact. You are born in the darkness. Your parents tell you stories of a thing called the sun that used to be bright and warm, but you've never seen it. You grow up hungry, and you see empires fall. And yet, humanity didn't just survive that century. We emerged from it and eventually built the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the modern world. Every one of these deadliest years is a mountain that we had to climb. And from the top of each mountain, we could see a little further. We learned a little more about how to stay alive, how to treat one another, and how to build a world that can withstand the next storm. We often think of history as a list of dates and names, but it's actually a story of energy. It's the energy of people refusing to give up. In the 1600s, during the worst of the cold and the wars, people were writing some of the most beautiful music and poetry ever conceived. In the 1340s, Boccaccio was writing the Decameron. They were responding to the darkness with beauty. As we conclude this journey through the shadowed valleys of our past, remember that the deadliest years are not just footnotes of pain. They are the forge of the human species. They are the times when we were tested and not found wanting. From the volcanic winter of 536 to the industrial-scale struggles of the 20th century, we have proven that there is no night so dark that we cannot find our way back to the dawn. The story doesn't end in the darkness. It ends with us, here, now, looking back and learning. It ends with the realization that no matter how difficult the year, we have the collective memory and the collective strength to move forward. We are the survivors. We are the builders. And no matter what the future holds, we have the blueprint of the past to show us that the sun always, eventually, comes back out. History is not just a record of what happened. It's a manual for what we can endure. And if we can endure the year 536, if we can survive the 1340s, and if we can overcome the 1940s, then there is nothing we cannot handle together. The deadliest years in human history are behind us, and they have made us exactly who we are today. A resilient, brilliant, and unyielding people who never stop looking for the light.